I think, we are on the brink of a technological revolution. We've spoken about that, but the cultural revolution also. And this cultural revolution means that I don't have a boss called the president. I don't have a boss called the cabinet. I don't have some politician telling me what to do. I am the boss.
Hello, my name is Donald Ramaphosa and welcome to WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with a good friend and occasional host of WorldView, Dawie Roodt. Dawie is the chief economist at the Efficient Group, and he is not a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party. Dawie, good day and welcome to you.
I can only say, comrade, good day to you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction.
So, Dawie, many people see you as a leading economist in South Africa, and many look to you for financial advice. So today is the 31st of August. How bad is the financial situation in South Africa at the moment? How bad are things? Can you give us some data analytics? How bad are things?
Listening to your introduction, it sounded more like it's the 1st of April. Anyway, so how bad is the financial situation in South Africa? I think we have to make a distinction between the economic environment where we find ourselves and the financial environment. Those are two different things. They are different things because when you talk about finances, we usually talk about income and how financial markets are doing, and we talk about money. But when we talk about the economy, we talk about more things. We talk about politics, we talk about ideologies, we talk about policies and things like that. So, and of course, everything is interlinked. When you talk about the economy, quite often people refer by using the word economics, they actually mean finances. So let me try to give you a bit of a picture of what's going on in the South African economy. Getting to your financial question first. The average South African today is significantly worse off than last year and the year before and the year before. In fact, it's been a couple of years, every year where on a per capita basis, we have been getting poorer. So purely from a money point of view, things have deteriorated quite significantly in South Africa. So that is the financial answer to that. The economic answer to your question is that things are significantly worse than last year, worse than the year before, and things are deteriorating even further. And there are some economic indicators that I would like to highlight. Some of them, the most obvious one that most people look at and most people feel, quite literally feel this, is that unemployment number in South Africa. We can feel it because we quite often go to bed hungry. We can feel that because you sit at home waiting for somebody to offer you a job. So unemployment has gone up, and unemployment currently, depending which one of the definitions you want to follow, but it doesn't really matter. But unemployment in South Africa is at a record high. We have exceptionally high levels of unemployment, and compared to our peers, we've got the highest levels of unemployment. And amongst the youth, we have particularly high levels of unemployment. And because of weak economic growth, high levels of unemployment, it's easy to understand that poverty will go up with that, and people are actually going to bed hungry. Now, what's the reason for all of this? And I think there are many reasons for that, but if I want to point my finger to one institution that I think is primarily responsible for the mess in which we found ourselves, it must be the government, and it must be specifically the ANC government. And you can broaden that a little bit and say it must be the tripartite alliance. And why I say it is a tripartite alliance, because there's very little difference between, in fact, there are many members of the SACP, the Communist Party, that are actually part of the South African government. And we know all the names of those. And by the way, those communists that are part of the South African cabinet, they're not necessarily corrupt, but they're trying to implement the most silly policies that have been proven by many countries in the world that it can't work, and they keep on doing that. So it's an outdated, let's call it a stupid ideology that is still followed by the ANC government because it's part of the whole thing. So then getting to the efficiency of government. So they follow the wrong things, they do the wrong things, but not only do they do the wrong things, they do the wrong things badly. And with that, I mean they are highly incompetent in many things, and I can give you all the numbers. And on top of all of that, we've got corruption and mismanagement and everything that goes with that. The ANC is one massive patronage, and they are sucking this economy dry. And that's the reason. Of course, there are many other reasons. We had COVID, and because of that, the lockdown. But the lockdown itself was a mess because of the way the government managed that. Then we had the program whereby the state was supposed to support the economy, like many other countries in the world. But that was a mess as well because of the mismanagement by government. But before that, even before we've heard of a place called Wuhan, the South African economy was already in deep trouble. So yes, there are many reasons. And of course, there's always some sort of financial crisis somewhere, and it impacts on the South African economy. We're part of the world economy. But all countries in the world go through the same kind of crises. They get out on the other side much better than us. And so the main reason that I must point out is that we have a government that is causing all these hardships in South Africa. And that's the reason why we are where we are today.
What is the current unemployment rate again? Do you trust that figure? Do you think it's much higher than it really is?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting number. Currently, the unemployment rate in South Africa is 34.4%. The unemployment rate, the expanded definition for unemployment in South Africa is at 44.4%. And the difference between the two is that in the one instance, people are actually actively looking for jobs. In the other instance, they're not looking for a job. But if you look at people, say the youth below 30 years or below 25 years, whatever your definition, it's significantly higher. And in some instances, above 60%. If you look at rural areas compared to urban areas, there's a huge difference there as well. Rural unemployment is significantly higher. So it's all over the place. The bottom line is that unemployment is very, very high in South Africa, and it's unacceptably high. You ask me if I trust this number? Yes, I do trust this number. I think Stats South Africa is one of those institutions that is actually doing quite a good job. Sometimes there are some questions about some of the stats, but they're still doing an excellent job. So I've got all the best regard for Stats South Africa. They're doing an excellent job. But I don't trust this number because I believe that the informal sector in South Africa is significantly bigger than what we think. So the technical part, the technical calculation of unemployment in South Africa and the definitions for unemployment in South Africa, all of that is done correctly by Stats South Africa. But because South Africa is an unusual place, I believe that our informal sector is perhaps much, much bigger, which means that many people are employed, but not officially employed. Let me give you an example. If somebody is unemployed, if you ask a person if he's employed, he may say, listen, I'm unemployed, but at the same time, he's renting out a back room somewhere in his house, or he's selling tomatoes or whatever. So he's generating an income of some sorts, but officially that person is unemployed. So yes, I believe the number, but I think we have to understand what's included in the number. And part of that is that I believe that the informal sector in South Africa is much bigger than what we think.
And
which, by the way, it's good news, by the way.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I can believe it's a bit difficult to determine that number, especially if you drive into certain of these areas and like the Transkei. How can they know who's working there and who's not? But the state of our SOEs, is there one SOE that Dawie Roodt would give the Dawie Roodt stamp of approval? One SOE that's self-sufficient, that you believe is doing a proper job?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by an SOE. If you talk about an SOE as a so-called company, like, for example, Eskom or South African Airways, I don't think we have SOEs in South Africa. Let me explain what I mean by that. Because if you call South African Airways an SOE, then, I mean, a state-owned enterprise is a complete contradiction. They call themselves companies. They have boards and they've got chairpersons and all that, and directors and huge salaries and all that, but they're not companies. So they're not companies. They're not enterprises. They are just some subdivision of some department somewhere. So we don't have state-owned enterprises. They pretend to be, but they're not really. So most of the state-owned, well, in fact, most of the state is dysfunctional in South Africa. But there are a couple of things that still work that is part of the state. You may not classify them necessarily as an enterprise. I think Stats South Africa is certainly one of those. by doing a good job. I think the Auditor General is also doing a fair job. I also think that the South African Reserve Bank, which is technically not a state-owned enterprise because it belongs to the private sector, to private shareholders like myself, for example. So that is in excellent hands. They're doing an excellent job there. And I guess we can down a couple of local authorities, a few, only a handful, but there are some local authorities that's actually doing a good job. But for the rest, it's very difficult for me to really point to something that works well, that is under control of government. There were some exceptions, like what I've mentioned. And we've got another institution that is under control of the state, of course, is the new under Balisa Baloy. What's her name? The new prosecutor. I've forgotten her name for a moment.
Yeah,
I think she's doing a good job as well. I'm sitting really and waiting for her to start making some major arrests. But so far, I think she's doing an okay job, but she better start moving and start arresting some of those high-flying politicians before I give her a real stamp of approval. So the jury is still out on her. But for the rest, I'm afraid to say there are very, very few things that's under control of government that really works well.
When do you think South Africa's sort of D-Day will arrive? When will interest on debt become unsustainable? And what do you think we will do? What will we turn towards the IMF, to the Chinese, perhaps to Zimbabwe? What will we do? Where will we get the money?
Many people ask me this, and many people think there's a sort of a D-Day, a day where this thing called South Africa runs into a brick wall. There's no such day. There's no day when all of a sudden all the lights are switched off. Oh, well, let me rephrase, that happens quite often. But there's no end to this. There's no end. I think there are various things that's going to happen, and I think it's gradual process of deterioration. People also ask me if South Africa is going to become like Zimbabwe, and the answer to that is no. We're not going to become like Zimbabwe. We're going to become like a failed South Africa. There are things that may look the same as in Zim, but it's going to be different. Zimbabwe and Venezuela are both failed states, but they look different. There are differences. So we're not going to become like Zimbabwe, but there will be certain things that will look quite similar. So what's going to happen? There are a few things that I think is going to happen. One is that if you look at the fiscal accounts, which I analyze quite extensively, it has become unsustainable. The state is too big. The state is massively inefficient. The debt level is going up at an unsustainable rate. So if we only look at that, where is this going to end? And again, it's not going to end, but where is it heading to? And it's heading to things like the day is going to come when we will have to pay more and more if we want to borrow money, the state, because the savers will demand a higher return for this risk that they are taking. And eventually the state will find that, listen, this interest burden is becoming too onerous, and they're going to force people to lend money to the state. It's called prescribed assets. And then people are going to take the money out whenever they can. The rand's going to come under pressure even more, that sort of stuff. And the day is also going to come when the politicians realize that they cannot repay all this debt anymore, but they want to borrow even more. So what do? You try to get rid of debt. There are a number of ways of getting rid of debt, but the most popular way of getting rid of debt is to simply inflate it away. And that means that you have to pressurize the Reserve Bank to keep on printing money, lack of a better word, and that leads to inflation. So I think we are heading for very high levels of inflation, because inflation undermines the value of money, but it also erodes the value of debt. So that's one way of getting rid of your debt. But you can't deflate your dollar-denominated debt away, because we're not controlled in the Federal Reserve in the US. But fortunately for us is that we don't have that much foreign-denominated debt on the balance sheet. It's only about 10% of total outstanding debt. So if you talk about debt and only debt, then I think what we're probably going to see is high levels of inflation, which will reduce that. So that's one part of the answer to that. By the way, we've seen that the same sort of thing happened in Zim, the same sort of thing happened in Venezuela. And that is a characteristic of a country that is in deep financial trouble or economic problems. And that is that the high levels of inflation, as simple as that. So that is something that I think is going to happen. Something else that's going to happen because of the unsustainability of the fiscal accounts, we will see that the state will spend less money in real terms. Politicians will try to spend more. They don't like cutting back on state spending. But in real terms, there will be less money. There is simply less money available to spend. Now, they can huff and they can puff and do whatever they want to, but if you don't have money, you don't have money. You can increase the money supply by printing more money, but this money will not necessarily be worth much. It's called inflation. So that means that the police and the civil servants and the 30 million, let me repeat that, Nami, 30 million people that receive an income from the state every month.
Wow.
Their income will fall. Now, if you take money away from especially poor people, they get very angry. And we saw what happened in KZN and Gauteng. And I think part of the reason for that and what really happened there, I can't get my head around, but part of the reason for what we saw there has to do with finance or economics. And that is what the Minister of Finance promised us. He's going to cut back on state spending, and he is going to cut back on this money that he spends on 30 million people. And they're going to get angry. We're going to see more social tension, more political tension in South Africa. And remember, it's important for the state to keep on spending this amount of money because that is what the ANC government is. It is one patronage system that feeds off the state, but they ran out of money now, and people that got used to this amount of money that they receive every month will suddenly start getting less, and in some instances, 9 million of them will completely stop getting an income by February next year. This is this extra grant. So that's the next thing that's going to happen. And again, this is not going to happen overnight. I think we're going to see, again, flare-ups of these looting and marches and everything that goes with that we saw a month or two or so ago in South Africa. So that's another thing that I think is going to happen. Another thing that's going to happen because of the confidence or no confidence in the South African government and the South African economy is that rich people is going to say, listen, I've had enough of all of this. I want to take my money out. And if they take their money out, it leads to a weaker currency. And a weaker currency means more inflation and the whole thing happens all over again. Or what happens is the rich people say, listen, I'm going to rather go somewhere else and I'm going to create wealth there because they steal my money here or they overtax me in this place. I don't want to be here anymore. It's called the flight of capital and the flight of talent as well. And you don't have to go away physically. I mean, you and I be talking over internet now. A lot of people work, you can work anywhere in the world. You don't. So that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen. We will gradually sort of deteriorate into something worse than what we have today. But it's not going to come to an end one day. Certain things will come to an end and certain new things will start. But the slope on which we find ourselves today is not a nice place. Poverty will go up, unemployment is likely to go up, social tension, inflation is going to go up, a weak economic growth. All those things that are bad are likely to be part of whatever future we have in South Africa. But maybe one day we're going to get a government that we kick out this incompetent government, we get a good political party, or maybe one day there's a Damascus moment for the president and he decides to really shuffle the cabinet and get rid of all that dead wood. And then maybe one day we get a competent minister of police. Who knows? Maybe that can happen. But for now, I'm not holding my breath.
Well, we've heard it. We should just give Ramaphosa a supermajority and then everything will change. But I mean, do you think anything will change with our new Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana? Do you think anything will change with his appointment?
Well, I can tell you, I think he's in a slightly better position to do the right thing than Tito Mboweni. I like Tito Mboweni. I liked him because he's a bit of a maverick, and I like it whenever he shakes the cage of his colleagues a little bit. It's always a good thing. But
he also, to a degree, he didn't have anything to lose. That's why he was so vocal.
Yeah, it was clear he was only keeping the seat warm for somebody else. I liked him. He was the best, I think, at the time because the financial markets trusted him because of his background at the Reserve Bank and all that. So it was time for him to go, and it's an open secret that he wasn't in office that much, really. The new Minister of Finance, he's an insider. I think he's got the experience. He's been around for some time. I think he's got more support than Tito Mboweni had. I think he's the right guy. And I also think that, like Tito Mboweni, he's for a lack of a better word, let's call him a conservative Minister of Finance. Let me replace conservative with a little bit more responsible Minister of Finance. So he said, let's call him a responsible Minister of Finance, which means that he understands the predicament in which the fiscal accounts are, and understands that he needs to cut back spending, especially on that 30 million people. So I think it's going to follow more or less the same trajectory and more or less the same policies that Tito Mboweni followed. The only difference is that he's probably going to get a little bit more support from cabinet. So with a bit of luck, we're going to see a bit of an improvement on a slower deterioration on the fiscal accounts with the new Minister of Finance. There's only one little issue, and that there are certain allegations about certain skeletons in certain cupboards. Now, that is really, really unfortunate. I like this guy. I think it's a good choice, but you need a Minister of Finance that is absolutely squeaky clean. And I'm afraid that box cannot be ticked. So that is the only downside. For the rest, I think it's a good guy. Let's see what happens.
They'll probably use that against him the moment he tries to institute good reforms. Oh, but you're
good
corrupt.
Point.
And but yeah, it's frightening the extent of the corruption in the ANC. I mean, the recent case of Zweli Mkhize. Yeah, it's just frightening to hear these stories. I mean, it's like you can trust nobody of them, or not one of them.
Zweli Mkhize is a good example. So the prosecuting authorities, apparently they've got a good and a strong case against him, because why would Cyril Ramaphosa fire him if that's not the case? So has he been arrested?
No.
No. So what now?
Yeah. But Dawie, my family and I, we do a lot of road trips, and on the road trips we listen to a lot of podcasts, the interviews that you have done on WorldView, and we repeatedly hear this term. You say the rand has lost 99% of its value, and we've debated this, and we have no idea what that means. Can you explain to us and to our viewers in layman's terms, what does it mean when you say the rand has lost 99% of its value?
Okay, if you go to university, they will teach you all sort of things, and quite often they teach you the wrong things. But one thing that they taught me in monetary economics is that the definition for inflation is the continuous increase in the prices of most goods and things. So in simple terms, things are getting more expensive. That's the definition of inflation. But there's another definition for inflation, and this is the one that I prefer. And that definition is the value of the money, the value of the currency keeps on falling. It's the same thing. So things be getting more expensive, because it's a relative game. Things getting more expensive means that your currency, the rand, is becoming less valuable. And if you look at it from that point of view, that your currency becomes less valuable, then you also understand that things like, for example, an increase in the petrol price is not inflation. Because the definition is that most prices of most things must get more expensive. Only then is it inflation. While the other definition says that the value of your currency falls. And an increase in the petrol price, if the beer price falls, for example, doesn't mean your currency loses value. It simply means there's a change in the relative prices in the basket. Anyway, coming back to your question. So if you follow the second definition of money, that money keeps on losing value, then that explains why we say that the South African rand has lost nearly 99% of its value, which simply means that 1 rand today can buy 1% of stuff that it bought 60 years ago.
Wow.
So roughly speaking, 10 cents today, no, 1 cent today, 1 cent today is equal to a 1 rand 60 years ago.
And in relative terms, do you know, for example, how much the Zimbabwe dollar has lost its value?
Well, a currency will never lose 100% of its value. It cannot lose 100% of its value because you can still use it to make fire. You can still use it as firewood.
Toilet paper.
So you can never reach zero because the piece of paper will have some sort of value. But the Zim currency, for all practical purposes, has lost all its value. In fact, it's lost so much value that people don't want to have it anymore, don't take it anymore. And that is the sign of a currency. And that's the reason why we trust not the same as we used to, but we still trust. If you give me 100 rand, I will accept that because I believe somebody else is going to take it from me. And that's why we prefer to have US dollars, because we are very sure somebody else is going to take US dollars from me again. And that has to do with and that's why the US dollar maintains its value better than the South African currency, simply because of confidence, more confidence. There are other reasons as well, but more confidence in the US dollar than in the South African rand. And that, by the way, is also part of the reason why we can have so-called fiat currencies. Fiat currencies simply mean that a government or a central bank can create money out of nothing, because there's trust in that particular institution. In the case of South Africa, it's called the South African Reserve Bank. In the case of America, it's called the Federal Reserve of the United States. So, and that is what money is, simply trust in a specific institution. And in the case of South Africa, we've lost 99% of our trust in the South African Central Bank.
Wow. And many would now blame the central banks for the fact that the currencies have lost so much value, the policies of the central banks. And we've seen them flirting with negative interest rates, right? Like minus 0. Minus 1. I mean, perhaps I'm being stupid, but I mean, can't they expand on that? Can't they go from -1 to -2 to -3 to -4? And if they can do that, haven't we even begin to see the madness of the central banks?
Yeah, let's just first dispel a myth. And that is that, central banks are independent. You can ask them. All central banks in the world or most of them would like to say that they are independent. Also the South African Central Bank. But if we're really, really honest, we will realize and accept that central banks are not really independent. They are part of this big machinery called government. They sort of independent in terms of the Lesetja Kganyago can change interest rates. But in the end, it's Lesetja Kganyago is appointed by the president. And the profits of the South African Reserve Bank is transferred to the state. So it's part of this big machine called the state in South Africa. But nevertheless, they like to think they're independent. They're not really. So how does it work? Some of this. When governments borrow money, they, for example, would borrow money from a bank, and they will give the bank a piece of paper called the government bond. And the bank will take this government bond to the South African Reserve Bank as an example. This is simplified. And the Reserve Bank will print 100 rand and give it back to the bank. And the government will go back to the bank and borrow another 100 rand and give them a piece of paper. And the bank will go back to the central bank and give them. And so the whole story goes on. So basically, because government paper or government debt is seen as the best quality debt in the country, the central bank always accepts that as collateral if banks want to go and borrow money from the central bank. So that's how this whole system works. So it creates, they try to create this impression that they're completely independent, but they're not really. And I've just explained, I mean, this whole process makes it clear. So basically, the Minister of Finance prints money, but he doesn't do it in so many words. What he does, he issues paper to the banks, and the banks convert that into money at the South African Central Bank. The central bank, if the whole thing works well, they usually have, like in the case of South Africa, they've got something called inflation targets. And if you keep on doing this process that I've just explained, it will lead to a huge increase in money supply eventually, and it will lead to inflation and that sort of stuff. So what central banks do, they typically will have things like inflation targets, and they try to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of hand. And of course, there's this whole confidence thing as well that we've spoken about. And they will increase interest rates or reduce interest rates depending on what happens to inflation. But central banks have a bit of a problem. And we don't have that problem, but internationally, some of the big ones, they have this problem. And their problem is that if inflation falls, they can cut interest rates. And if it falls even further, they can cut interest rates even further. And the day will come when they've cut interest rates to zero. Now, what now? That's a bit of a dilemma. Because if a central bank cuts interest rate to below zero, then it means that if you go to a bank and you borrow money from the bank, then the bank pays you to take money. Now, that sounds very weird, but there are cases like this. For example, if you want to lend the money to the Japanese government, you have to pay them before they take your money. They have interest rates below zero. But the problem with central banks is that also if they cut interest rates below zero, then people are not going to make deposits at the banks anymore, because if I make a deposit at the bank, I have to pay the bank to take my money. Now that doesn't make sense, because I lose money if I put the money at the bank. So it will be better for me to withdraw all my cash and put it under my bed, because now at least I've got the cash and I don't have to pay the bank. The problem is it costs money to put money under my bed, because I have to hire a guard to look after my money, especially in places like South Africa. So there's a price to be paid for keeping money in cash. And economists used to think that you cannot reduce interest rates below zero, but now we realize you can do that, because it costs money to have cash in a safe in your house with a guard with a gun. And that is probably that real, what we call zero bound, is not zero, but it's probably around about minus 0.5%. So you can cut interest rates to roughly minus 0.5, but not more than that, because then it makes sense to buy a new vault and pay somebody to look after your money. But there is a way for central banks to cut interest rates even below 0.5% or minus 0.5%. And that is with this new currency that central banks are experimenting with, and that's central bank digital money. It's like private, like Bitcoin and that sort of stuff, but issued by central banks, bank digital currency. And if you use central bank digital currency, then central banks can simply reduce the value of that central bank digital currency, whether you like it or not, because they are in control of your money. And that's the next thing. That's what I think. Some central banks got it already. The Chinese bank is a good example, because central banks cut interest rates to encourage us to spend the money. People don't want necessarily to spend the money, but if you realize your central bank digital currency is becoming less valuable, then you're going to spend it. It's unlike cash. Cash I can put under my bed, for example, but central bank digital currency is under control of your central bank. There are different varieties of this, of course, but it's typically under control of your central bank, and they can simply erode the value of your currency and forcing you to spend this money as soon as possible. And that's exactly the same as negative interest rates. But where the world is at the moment, in the big countries in the world, the US, Europe, and so on, interest rates are extremely low, in some cases at zero or even below zero. And central banks are printing money out of nothing. We have some inflationary pressures internationally, which means that we might see interest rates going up a little bit internationally, but the jury is still out on that. And for now, that is not an issue that central banks need to cut interest rates. There's a possibility that they may start increasing interest rates over the next couple of months or so. But that's an interesting experiment for central bank to have cut interest rates down to zero, or actually below zero in some instances the past 10 years or so.
So if I understood you correctly, they can't get it below 0.5 because that will essentially lead to the downfall of the banks, because nobody's going to deposit their money in the banks anymore.
That is, and not only, there are some other issues as well. If a central bank creates its own central bank digital currency, it's like a Bitcoin for central banks, if you like. And they've done it. There are examples of that already. Like the best example is the Chinese central bank. Then basically what happens is that it is like having cash, but it's electronic cash in a way. You can have it on your phone. So you have it on your cell phone, and I can pay you with my cell phone. But the central banks know who I am. They know how much cash I have in an electronic form on my cell phone. And they can reduce the value of that if they want to, which is equal to negative interest rates, for example. But it also means that I don't have to go to a bank to make a deposit at the bank, because for all practical purposes, I have an account at the central bank. So yes, the introduction, interest rates below zero means that people will not deposit money at the banks. You're absolutely correct on that. But central bank digital currency also means the same, that people are not going to go to the banks to deposit money anymore, because I basically have an account at the central bank. So why go to the banks? So whatever is going to happen in future, I can tell you one thing, and that is the banks are probably going to pull the short end of the stick here. and there's some significant changes that's going to happen, especially on payment systems. It's happening already. PayPal is a good example. Bitcoin, all these other things are all good examples of payment systems that are actually circumventing the banks. And the introduction of central bank digital currency is going to make life even more difficult for the banks. So banking is going to change, and banking, or at least banks the way we understand what banks are supposed to be, are going to disappear. Remember, the essence of a bank is that they stand between a saver and a borrower. And if the borrower and the saver can meet each other somewhere else, why go through a bank? That's basically what it comes down to. Yes, so banking is changing, and it will keep on changing, and quite dramatically.
Yeah, and a point I found fascinating in the interview you did with Uli Koorts is where you said that it's possible that they will completely wipe out the debts, the debt that the governments have, the states have at the moment. Is that the only thing they can do? And are they really seriously consider doing that?
Yeah, okay, well, there are plenty. What you've just said is really an interesting question, and we can talk the whole day about that. But let's just get back to what we've spoken about already. That's inflation. Inflation wipes out the debt of debtors, but it wipes out the savings of savers as well. That's what inflation does. So that's one way of getting away from debt. Simply wipe it out with inflation. But there's another way, and this is an interesting one. We spoke about this previously, and in fact, we've just spoken about it as well, is that in the case of the United States, as an example, now let me just take a step back. Remember, we said that the central bank is supposed to be independent, but if we're really honest, we will admit that it's actually part of this big thing called the state. So in the case of the Federal Reserve in the United States, for example, and to a lesser extent in the case of South Africa as well, but in the case of the Fed, what they do, every month, they print $120 billion, and they take this $120 billion and they buy stuff with that. Typically, government debt instruments. Some other stuff as well, but they will buy government debt instruments. They give it a fancy name.
Sorry, doesn't that also erode your independence when you buy assets of the...
Yeah, of course. But they say they're independent because they can decide what happens to monetary policy, to interest rates. And Jerome Powell, they just had a big fancy meeting at a place called Jackson Hole, where they talked about these sort of stuff. And he made it clear that he's going to start buying less, or reduce his every month this so-called quantitative easing to less than 120 billion. We need the details a little bit later this year. So let's keep an eye on what's going to happen there. But for now, they print $120 billion every month extra, and they buy stuff with that. So what happens is that the Federal Reserve, they accumulate more and more government debt or state debt on their balance sheet. And at the moment, they've got gazillions of that, a lot. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars of so-called assets on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. But like I've said, if we're really honest, it's the same thing, really, the US government and the US Federal Reserve. So it is quite possible, and I can't see why they don't do that. It is very possible that one day the Fed can simply say, let's forgive all this debt and we cancel it. And it's gone. It's off the balance sheet of government, and it's off the balance sheet of the Fed, and nothing is going to happen. Let me give you another example. Remember, when a central bank issues a note, that is a liability on the balance sheet of the central bank. So the central bank promises you that if you bring this note back, they will give you something in return. In the old days, they will give you a piece of gold in return. But nowadays, if you bring in them a note, they will give you the same note back. So that's what they're going to give you back in return. I promise to pay the bearer, it says on the note, 10 Rand for 10 Rand. So that's how it works nowadays. But they do not pay. It's a liability. They issue the notes, but it's not a liability. Well, it is a liability, but they do not pay interest on this liability. Okay. In a case of a government or a treasury in a government, like what our new Minister of Finance will be doing, he will do exactly the same, but he will give his currency another name. He call it government bonds. So he will sell a government bond to a pension fund, and he will pay the difference. There are two differences. He will pay an interest on this government bond. The central bank doesn't pay an interest, but he is prepared to pay an interest. Additionally, he also guarantees that after a period, he will buy back this bond for money, for cash, central bank cash. So the difference between a government bond and a central bank money is the one's got a redemption date and the other one has not. The one pays interest and the other one does not. But now the thing is getting a little bit blurry, because what happens, like in some instances, if a government issues a bond and pays 0 interest on that? And what happens if a government issues a bond with no redemption date on it? And there are cases like that. So a perpetual bond, then that's exactly the same as money, isn't that? It's money. And that is why there is a bit of a blur. What is really government debt and what is really central bank money? It is, in the end, the same thing. Therefore, a central bank can create money in the form of notes, and they can replace their money with government bonds, and they can destroy money, they do it every day, and they can destroy government bonds, and nothing will really happen. And that's one way. Another way of getting rid of your debt. And I've got a suspicion this is probably what is going to happen. So you keep it in your balance sheet forever and a day, or you simply write it off. And it's the same thing.
Well, that's fascinating. But how do you think they're going to sell that? How are they going to sell that to the public? Oh, yeah, it was 20 trillion or 30 trillion debt. Now it's gone. It's like, how do you sell that?
They've done it already. They sold it to the public already. I mean, economists talk about this every day. I talk about it every day. And you and I are discussing it now. So we accept that it's been sold already. They have all these assets on their balance sheet. And as long as they don't have a big inflation problem, it's okay. And worldwide, we don't have a big inflation problem. Well, not yet. It could be. But for now, it's not an issue. Fine. Just keep on printing money. As long as you don't get inflation or too much inflation.
And probably a lot of people won't even realize it because they don't know the economic situation of countries anyway, or the debt situations anyway. So if it's 20 trillion or nothing or whatever going on, I mean, people are just going to continue living their lives. Exactly.
So the Fed in the United States, the Federal Reserve and the government there, they can simply call one another one day and say, listen, you owe me so many trillions and on my balance sheet, I'll do you a favor and just write it off. How's that? Then tomorrow morning, I've got a clean balance sheet and you owe less.
Yeah,
I don't have the asset. It is assets, by the way, for the central bank, but it's a liability for the state. But it's the same thing. So how can you owe money to yourself in a way?
Yeah, I'll write it off and I'll send you a Johnny Walker Blue just to seal the deal. But you love to talk about private currencies. Why do you believe private currencies hasn't really taken off? What is still the major barrier to a private currency? Why are we still trading with rands?
Yeah. Oh, well, there are many reasons for that. But the most important reason, and yes, I absolutely love private currencies. Now, I just want to make the point, and anybody, what I say here is don't go and invest in these sort of things. Be extremely careful. So I'm not advising people to go and buy Bitcoin or Tether or whatever it is. So be very careful.
Have you gotten angry emails?
But I'm super, super excited about the technology. And I will advise people to get involved some way or the other, but be very, very careful. And just by the way, I can also reveal that we are in the process of issuing, my company, our own currency, private currency, which is a so-called stable coin, and we're experimenting with something like that. But we can talk about it one day, but we're certainly doing that, and I'm very excited about that. Why hasn't private currency taken off so much yet? There are many reasons and many good reasons for that. One is that we haven't completely lost confidence in the dollar. So why replace it with something else if there's still something that you've been accustomed to for a long time, something like the dollar or normal other fiat currencies? Another reason is that there's a whole system built around the dollar and the rand. There's an existing infrastructure and an existing environment that was created around this. It's called the payment systems, it's called credit cards, it's called banks, it's called deposits, it's called all these sort of things. Monetary, it's part of an existing thing. And this thing has evolved over many decades and millennia, and you're not going to stop and change this overnight. So that's the second one. A third reason is that central banks, if we allow private currencies to take over, central banks and governments will lose a lot of control. And we know them. That's why they're politicians. They want control over things. So they're not going to make life easy for us to take over, to start our own private currencies. Another reason is because there are a lot of crooks out there, plenty of them. People, there's new technology promising you the sun and the moon and the stars, and before you know it, your money is gone. And every day we hear about these sort of things. So be careful, people. And another thing is, I think the technology is still gradually developing, and there are many loopholes and things that we need to understand. But perhaps the single most important reason why we don't see why it's not more widely used is because it takes time for people to get used to a new technology. And somebody once said, when you come across a new technology, you're all excited, but there are two things that happen. The first one is that it always takes longer for new technology to really become part of our lives. Look at cell phones. Cell phones have been around since the 1970s. So it always takes longer to really do what it promises to do. And secondly, when people start using it, it happens quicker than what you think. And that's what's going to happen to private currencies as well. So what we've seen, it was this funny teenagers with funny looks and bare feet and computer geeks. Hippies. These funny people that talked about it 10 years ago. Bitcoin, what's this? It's never going to happen and so on. And today we all talk about it. Today it's sort of mainstream stuff. So maybe that suddenly that moment is coming closer when it suddenly becomes completely and totally acceptable and everybody uses this. In fact, like I've said, even some central banks have started issuing their own central bank digital currencies, which is not private, of course. It's central bank stuff, but they pretty much make use of this similar kind of currencies. And I also think because central banks, they say so. They say they want to devalue. They want to erode the value of their currencies. In the case of the South African Central Bank, they tell us they want the South African rand to lose between 3 and 6% of its value out every year. They tell us that. Wow. It's called inflation targeting. And in the case of the Federal Reserve in the United States, they also tell us they want the dollar to lose its value. Private currencies, if the whole thing is managed correctly in the way I understand it, will compete with one another, and they will certainly not tell us they want this currency to lose value. And the good ones, the ones that maintain value, will survive, while the bad ones, like the South African rand that's lost 99% of its value, must eventually disappear because the guy that creates it, the central bank, tells us they want it to lose its value. Are you going to invest in something where the creator thereof tells you that he wants that thing to lose value?
And probably Bitcoin was an asset at the start because it brought attention, like you say, to the private currency world. But to a certain degree, it's now a liability because people see that fluctuating prices. One day it's plus $10,000, the next day it's minus $10,000. Oh no, I don't want to invest in this. So to a certain degree, Bitcoin has also become a bad rep for the private currency world. But
I think there's a lot of things that still need to happen. I think in a case of, for example, Bitcoin is perhaps not a very good example because it's, despite the fact that it's very exciting new stuff, the technology is actually, and I'm not an expert in this, but the technology is actually a bit old. It's quite expensive to do transactions in Bitcoin. Some of the other so-called cryptocurrencies are perhaps a little bit better. I think the technology will eventually evolve. And I think once we start creating more and more derivatives of these private currencies, then things will stabilize gradually. And I think some of these private currencies will take on different functions. So typically, you will find a currency like Bitcoin, which is expensive to transact in, that you put your savings in Bitcoin. I'm just using that as an example. While you use another one, like, for example, Ethereum, as to do transactions with, because transaction-wise, it's cheaper. You can't buy bread with Bitcoin. It's just too expensive, the transaction cost. So what you do every day, you take a small piece of your Bitcoin, you convert that into another one where the transaction costs are lower, and you use that to buy your bread and your beer, whatever. So I think some of these private currencies will start specializing in various things. And remember, it's also possible for private currencies to change the nature of this, let me give you an example what I mean by that. If, for instance, I take a call on your cell phone. I've got a call option and I can buy your cell phone for 100 Rand in 1 year's time. Then I can, and in 1 year's time, I can go to you and I say, listen, I exercise this call option and now it's my cell phone and I give you the 100 Rand. I give you the document, the call option. So the call option becomes, it redeems. So before that, I can sell this call option. For example, I can sell this call option to somebody else, and that can be used as a form of money, because eventually this call option will be converted into a cell phone, for example. So what I'm trying to say is that the nature of money can change, and the blockchain will accommodate that and make it possible for that to turn into something else. So it may be a contract to start off with, and then gradually this contract will be converted into money. If it makes sense, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So where's that border between something that's money and not money? I think we have to redefine money. Money, the definition for money is anything that is generally accepted as money, and I accept that. But then there are some characteristics of money that it must be a unit of account. It must be you must be able to use it for transactions. You must be able to save in. Those are the three requirements for money. But I think a fourth requirement for money is that, and that should be included in the definition of money somehow, is that money is basically information. It is, and it's information that can change, like this example that I've just mentioned. So this thing, money is a bit of a difficult concept, and in the modern world, I think money will rather refer to money as information. And this information can tell you, I can buy a car with this, or this information can tell you that I'm the owner of that, or this information can tell you that this contract can be converted into cash provided certain conditions are met or whatever. And that's the nature of money, and that's how money is going to be defined in the future.
Well, what was your opinion? I know Libra, the Facebook currency, has now been basically shelved, but what was your opinion of pegging that currency against the value of many other currencies, like an indice of currencies? Do you think that's the way you should go?
And in fact, there are many examples exactly like that. They are called so-called stable coins. So there are some benefits in making use of these private currencies. One is that you can hide your identity, which is a good thing, I believe, mostly. So what people will do is that I will issue a stable coin, and I promise you I've got $1 million in cash in my vault, and I issue coins against that. And whenever you want to, you can come and convert your coin back to the dollars, and I'll give you $1. So I issue only 1 million coins, and I promise you I've got $1 million to back that up. And what happens in practice, people lie. They issue 1 million coins. They tell you they've got $1 million behind that, but they don't. But that is so that is the essence. That's the nature of, that's an example of a so-called stable coin, because it's a gold standard in a way. And whatever you can put, whatever you want to below or supporting this currency, you can put a basket of other currencies there. And that was the original idea of Libra. They've changed the name. It's not Libra anymore. It's something else now. Or you can put a share price there. Why not Microsoft shares or Facebook shares? So instead of having $1, have a share. So listen, whatever the value of Facebook shares are, this is the value of my Facebook coin, for instance. And that is exactly, by the way, the basis of the coin that we've issued. But again, we can talk about that at a later stage.
And you know that with a private currency, like you just said, you can hide your details. You can hide the transactions in the private currency. A lot of people talk about doing a tax revolt in South Africa. But do you think with the rise of a private currency, that is what will happen? It will finally happen. People will just stop paying taxes altogether.
Yeah, let me correct something. And again, I'm not the technical part. I'm not an expert on that. But the blockchain actually means that all transactions since the beginning of history is on a blockchain, and you can actually go back to any transaction on the blockchain. So in a way, it is completely transparent, and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. So the reason why your identity can be hidden is because of certain encryption technology.
You have the password.
Information of but the information about the transaction itself remains forever on the blockchain. So be careful. Don't. So there's a difference between the identity of the individual and the transaction. The transaction information is forever on the blockchain. Yes, to come back to your answer, yeah. It's if you use cash, for example, then you can do an illegal transaction behind closed doors somewhere, and you don't have to pay taxes because you've got cash and so on. But as we all know, it's becoming more and more difficult to use cash, because the banks ask you all sort of funny questions if you walk in there with R1 million. They say, listen, where did you get this? There are all sort of legislations forcing banks to ask all sort of uncomfortable questions. So cash becomes more and more difficult to do illegal transactions with. But encrypted currencies, you can actually do exactly the same. It is like cash, but the only difference is nobody can see who you are, depending on what technology you use, by the way. If you use central bank digital currency, then everybody knows what you're doing, especially the central bank. And they're going to tell SARS what you are doing, and you're going to pay your taxes. But in the case of, say, Bitcoin, for instance, it is indeed possible to hide your identity, to buy a Bitcoin in South Africa, and to go anywhere in the world and spend your money there as much as you like. And by doing that, you actually break a lot of laws, because there are laws preventing South Africans from taking money out of South Africa. It's called foreign exchange regulations. But Bitcoin is not limited to a certain geographic area. It's information, remember? And it's everywhere. It's nowhere, but it's also everywhere. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That is an opportunity for the private sector to pay less tax. And that is to do transactions with one another on the blockchain with encrypted technology, making it extremely difficult for SARS to actually be able to tax you, because that information will not, under certain circumstances, can be hidden from SARS, making it difficult for them to actually prove how much money you have to pay to SARS.
Interesting times await. But Dawie, I don't want to take up any more of your valuable time. Thank you so much for this interview. Is there anything else you want to add or plug or say that you're doing before we conclude?
Yeah, I can just tell you that I am so excited about the future. I think we are at the beginning of a revolution, a technological revolution. I also believe that we are at the beginning of another kind of a revolution. It's a cultural revolution. Up to now, what we work and we functioned in a certain society with a government and with a central bank, and you always have to ask permission for Big Brother to do A, B, and C. I think we are on the brink of a technological revolution. We've spoken about that, but the cultural revolution also. And this cultural revolution means that I don't have a boss called the president. I don't have a boss called the cabinet. I don't have some politician telling me what to do. I am the boss. I am the most important person in the world. And there's a cultural revolution, and technology will allow me to be and become the most important person in the world. And I intend to follow that trend. I like that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dawie. My name is Donald. And yeah, if you've liked our content, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. This has been WorldView.